Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Strauss and Associates and our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we have been moving sequentially, starting with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary, and they are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have her information on the last slide of the presentation today. And a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veterans Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the link provided to explore what PTACs can offer. Set Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources sought and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. Please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings, and also please stay tuned for information on their very popular B2G conference in May. Please contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on the screen if you do have any other questions. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now get in front of your federal humans sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt in Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit growfedbiz.com today. And if you're interested in selling to the federal government, you may need a contract vehicle. The most popular one is the GSA schedule. Learn more about the requirements, the proposal process, and how this contract vehicle may or may not be the right tool for you. Jennifer Strauss is teaching a series of several classes, as you can see here, with the Virginia PTAC and Mary Washington University. All classes are listed on our website under the events section with the registration links. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. And I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we have this year. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe, and this is a live webinar series held each month. These take place on the second Friday of each month this year at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, our panelists covered bid protests this month, and next month on April 9th, our panelists will be covering team agreements. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals. You can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available. Please email hello@jenniferstrauss.com for our media kit with pricing details. Also note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each webinar. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Marlena Ewald. Welcome, Marlena. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I am happy to do it. I am Marlena Ewald, as mentioned. I'm an attorney at FH&H, and we help a lot of GovCon clients out with anything ranging from contracting to bid protests to regulatory analysis. And so I think we can move forward to the next slide. Today, we will be covering DFARS Part 213, which is the Simplified Acquisition Procedures. I'm going to go to the next slide. So just a brief introduction. If you are familiar with this DFARS provision, then you are also likely familiar with FAR Part 13, which is the Simplified Acquisition Procedures. This should be read as a supplement to that. This is obviously specific for generally DoD contracts, but the purpose is the same. It's used to simplify the acquisition process for acquisitions of supplies or services under a certain dollar threshold. The thresholds, generally speaking, the micro purchase threshold is $10,000 and the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. There are some exceptions and variations to this, which we'll touch on in this presentation. It's much higher for commercial items, for example. There's emergency or peacekeeping, humanitarian operations, and we'll go through those. In general, the DFARS, this Part 213, is separated into 6 subparts. So this presentation will walk through at a high level each subpart. So we'll begin with procedures, and then we'll move forward to discussing actions at or below the micro purchase threshold. Moving on to the simplified acquisition methods, we'll touch on fast payment procedures, simplified procedures for certain commercial items, and then end with information on the 8A program and the simplified acquisition procedures. Can move to the next slide. So to begin, we'll start with general procedures. This is essentially a note that, even though we are using these simplified acquisition procedures, which, is meant to streamline the process, there is still a need to promote competition. The government is always going to want to ensure that they're getting a fair and reasonable price. They use these procedures, guidance, and information, PGI, to help the contracting officer with the different competition methods. There's a reference to it there, but you'll see throughout this DFARS provision will refer to these procedure guidance and information as well. The second one here, the soliciting competition, this really talks about specific evaluation factors that a contracting officer should keep in mind and are important for offerers to consider as well. So, for example, this first one, the contracting officer has to include an evaluation factor for any supply chain risk. When they're acquiring information technology covered systems, it's going to be, if it's a part of a covered system or is in support of a covered system, then the contracting officer is going to have to include the supply chain risk as an evaluation. So it's important to know a covered system is a defined term. So that's anything with national security systems. Think of information systems that include telecommunication systems operated by an agency. Think intelligence, military forces, but we're not talking about more administrative. We're not talking payroll or finance, even though they might involve these activities. So if you are going to be bidding on something that includes a covered system, there will be an evaluation factor for supply chain risk. The next point is really on limitations and prohibitions on the use of lowest price technically acceptable source process. So the general principle here is that, there's limitations on when the government can use this. It might be easier, yes, to say, if it's technically acceptable, we'll just go with the lower price. But there are minimum requirements that have to be met, and quality can't be more important. So, for example, there has to be a high degree of confidence that the technical proposal wouldn't result in a better quality to the government if it was done as best value, for example. So the contracting officer, if it's going to use this lowest price technically acceptable source process, needs to document for the file, describing the circumstances and justifying the use of this process. And then finally, the prohibition on the use of reverse auctions for personal protective equipment and aviation critical safety items. This is going to be a similar concept. You want to make sure that quality is important here and not just price. And for those that don't know, this reverse auction process is an interesting process where essentially you get to see the other offerors' prices, but you don't get the identity, and then the lowest price is bid. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so next we're still in procedures, and we're looking at the evaluation of quotations or offers. Essentially for competitive solicitations for supplies using FAR Part 13, which we said was the counterpart. So we're still looking at simplified acquisition procedures and are valued at or less than equal to $1 million under FAR subpart 13.5, which is simplified acquisitions for commercial items. Then the contracting officer has to consider the data available in the supplier performance risk system, specifically looking at past performance history for the federal supply class and PSC of the supplies being purchased. So if there is data in that system for the supplies that are being purchased, they have to use that as a evaluation factor. If there is no data in the system, then it'll mostly be a neutral assessment. So it's not going to be the contractor is not going to be evaluated favorably or unfavorably for past performance history if there is nothing in the system. A good note for offerors is to check the system. So you can't see other offeror systems, but you will be able to see your own. So obviously, since it's an evaluation point, you'll want to see what your record is. We can move to the next slide. Okay, so now we are jumping into the next subpart, actions at or below the micro purchase threshold. And so again, we're going to the general guidance that we've mentioned above, but the higher micro purchase threshold numbers, which we'll touch on, to support a declared contingency operation or to facilitate defense against nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological attacks. So those threshold numbers are going to be higher under FAR 13.201G, which is referenced essentially if it meets one of those criteria and it's inside the United States, it's going to be performed inside the United States and awarded inside the United States, then the micro purchase threshold is increased to $20,000. If it's going to be awarded and performed outside of the United States, then the threshold is increased to $35,000. And this is another rule, essentially, that the contracting officer can't procure or even renew contracts to procure anything that to carry out covered missions, to use covered defense telecommunications equipment as a substantial or essential component of the system. And those are all also defined terms. And so essentially, if you are offering telecommunication systems or equipment or services to the government, you are going to want to be very familiar with subpart 204.21, which prohibits certain telecommunication and video surveillance services or equipment from certain entities named in that clause. We can move to the next slide. So we are still at or below the micro purchase threshold. And the preferred method of purchasing is to use this government-wide commercial purchase card. For those of you who are not familiar with the card, it's essentially like a commercial credit card issued to authorized agency personnel to use to acquire and pay for supplies. So again, in the spirit of making acquisitions easier, this is the preferred method for anything under the micro purchase threshold. And then there are some exceptions, if the Deputy Secretary of Defense approves an exception because it feels like another electronic system is going to be more cost effective, for example, if an SDS makes a written determination that the sources do not accept the purchase card and they are actively seeking a source that does accept the purchase card. So there's those types of exceptions. And again, there's also always that contingency operation exception that we discussed as above as well, which think in, again, the context of military operations, where there may be some exceptions as well. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so now we are moving on to subpart 213.3, the simplified acquisition method. So this is the higher threshold. So again, circling back to the government commercial purchase card, like we said, it's the preferred use for anything at or below the micro purchase threshold. There are also uses for it between the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. It may be used as well. So first of all, the agency has to, the contracting officers would be authorized to use it. So there's the procedures again that they would need to follow to get the purchase. But for example, one exception is that you could use the commercial purchase card for a purchase that exceeds the micro purchase threshold, but does not exceed $25,000 if the purchase is made outside of the United States, for use outside of the United States, and is for a commercial item, but is not for work to be performed by employees recruited within the United States. It's not from prohibited sources, and it's not for ball or ruler bearings as end items. So there's a list of kind of exceptions, but it is a good way to acquire goods if they, as long as they don't meet those exceptions. And then again, there's an exception for contingency operations as well, that they can use the purchase card as long as the supplies being purchased are immediately available. One delivery and one payment will be made, and the requirements of the similar requirements are met, and the guidance is followed, mentioned above. The second part of this, the DFARS 213.302 purchase orders, is another method under the simplified acquisition that can be used to award contracts. Specifically here for the DFARS provision, the specifics are going to be in Part 13, but for this DFARS, there's required written acceptance for purchase orders for classified acquisitions. And in generally speaking, anything that is more administrative in nature is going to be issued as a unilateral modification where the contractor does not have to sign, but anything that falls outside that category will be issued as a bilateral modification where the contractor will be required to sign and the contracting officer will sign. For example, that's if there's an equitable adjustment that needs to be made because of a change order. Those are usually issued as bilateral modifications. So we can move to the next slide. So another method that could be used is the blanket purchase order agreements. Those are another simplified method for filling anticipated repetitive needs. For supplies or services, by establishing what's called a charge account with a qualified source of supply, so it's a contractor. So they would issue the BPA to the contractor, and the agency could order, its repetitive needs under that. And this DFARS provision specifically addresses that individual purchases for a substance may be made at any dollar value. However, it must satisfy the competition requirements of Part 16 for any action or not using simplified acquisition procedures. So typically, Part 16 is the competition requirements. Typically, anything at or below the simplified acquisition procedures gets generally accepted from those procedures, but if it's going to exceed this amount and you're using a BPA, the contracting officer has to use Part 6, which is the competition requirements. Again, with the caveat that there's still going to be competition and a fair and reasonable price determination, even if you're at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. Another method to award these contracts are through impress funds and third-party drafts. This is not used very often. It's a limited basis. It's here specific to DFARS on a very limited basis. Installation commanders and commanders of all activities with the authority may be granted authority to establish impress funds and third-party draft accounts. So think kind of small amounts and not big purchases here. And there has to be kind of a justification that you're not using one of the other methods available. For example, overseas transactions at or below the micro purchase threshold in support of a contingency operation or humanitarian or peacekeeping operation or classified transactions can use this. Next slide. Okay, and then so now another method is the purchase order invoice voucher. This is standard form 44. Again, not used a ton, but the standard form 44 is a pocket-sized purchase order form. It's for on-the-spot, over-the-counter purchases of supplies and non-personal services. When the contracting officer, for example, is away from the office or in an isolated activity or area. These purchases are going to be limited to $2,500 or less for supplies or services, which have to be immediately available. It has to be only one delivery and one payment, and it's determined to be more economical and efficient to use this method of purchase. And specific for DFARS here, they're talking about fuel and oil and overseas transactions and transactions in support of intelligence and other specialized activities. Next slide. Okay, so the next subpart is fast payment procedures. Individual orders may exceed the simplified acquisition threshold for brand name, commissary, refill substance, and medical supplies for direct shipment overseas. So this is kind of an exception to the rule. And in general, these fast payment procedures allow payments under limited conditions to a contractor before the government verifies that the supplies have been received and accepted. The procedures here, so basically the contractor is going to get paid fast, but when they submit the invoice, they're submitting a certification that, the supplies are going to be delivered, that, they've been placed with the post office or whatever common carrier. And then if they don't arrive or they arrive damaged, the contractor is going to be on the hook for replacing or repairing or correcting the supplies. So it's good in that, they can get payment fast, but the contractor still has the risk there, the obligation to repair and replace. Next slide, please. Okay, so next, under the simplified procedures, we are carved out for certain commercial items. even though, you know, there's a higher dollar threshold here at 7.5 million and, you know, we're still under the simplified procedures, if there's only one offer, they still need to follow the guidance and also special documentation requirements for sole source, including brand name acquisitions. Essentially, the contracting officer is still going to be obligated to follow certain procedures and, you know, write the proper justifications, even if it's following the simplified acquisition procedures and awarding commercial items. So, for example, you know, it's going to have to justify for the contract file why it needed to use other than full and open competition, and determine that the cost is fair and reasonable to the government, even though there's only one offer or it did a sole source. Okay. So now we will touch on the simplified acquisition procedures under the 8A program. For those of you not familiar with the 8A program, this is an SBA program, Small Business Administration program, that helps small businesses owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, and it limits competition. So these are set-aside contracts for the 8A. So there's whole sections and regulations on this, but specific here to the simplified acquisition procedures and award of contract, this is another way that that the government is trying to award, you know, make it easier to award contracts to these set-asides, and then also under the dollar threshold. So essentially, there is a partnership agreement between the SBA and the DoD, where the DoD agency can award directly these purchase orders to contractors, 8A contractors. They negotiate the price and the terms, and once that is agreed between the DoD agency and the contractor, they will submit the purchase order to the SBA and a notice basically telling them that it's been processed under this partnership agreement between the SBA and DoD. And then as long as the SBA doesn't come back within 2 business days and say that that 8A participant is unqualified or ineligible for the program, they can begin performance, and it's a streamlined way to get them started. There is this last section here that says essentially to purchase religious-related services to be performed on the United States military installation. They have to competitive purchases under the 8A program contract. They cannot exclude the nonprofit organizations, even if it is for an 8A set aside. Next slide. Okay. And then finally, this is still under the 8A program, and we already really touched on this, but the contracting officer does not need to obtain a contractor's written acceptance of a purchase order modification or a purchase order for an acquisition under the 8A program, and pursuant to this guidance that we discussed above, mentioning essentially the partnership agreement between SBA and DoD. So again, just trying to streamline the process of awarding these lower dollar threshold amounts to small businesses, specifically those in the 8A program. And I believe that is the last slide. Go to the next slide. So if there are any follow-up questions, my contact information is available there. Please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Marlena, for a great presentation and for sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we uncover more parts of the DFARS.